we weren't until right now. So we are recording the program. This will include both audio and video recording and will include the Q&A session. So if you prefer not to have your image appear on the video, you can click on the video icon on the bottom left of your screen to stop your video feed, and then people won't see your face. But we like to see your face, so we hope you don't do that. Let me introduce our guest speaker. We're very pleased to have with us this evening a person that I personally feel honored to have known for several years, even before coming here to Windsor Historical Society. Fiona Vernon is a native of, and if I get this wrong, please correct me, Trelawney, Jamaica. And did I get it close? She grew up in Trenton, New Jersey, earned a BA in history with a certificate in African American studies from Princeton University, and her MA and PhD from Yale. After completing her doctoral work in December 2003, she served as Director of African Studies at Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Professor Vernal has taught at the University of Connecticut's Department of History since 2005, where her courses focus on pre-colonial, colonial Africa, the history of South Africa, slavery, and the African diaspora. Her teaching incorporates inquiry-based learning and human rights practice, and her research has resulted in numerous published works and a number of fascinating exhibits, including the one we'll be opening here at Windsor Historical Society in June, entitled A Home Away from Home, Greater Hartford's West Indian Diaspora, which premiered at the West Indian Social Club of Hartford in 2017. Professor Vernal has recently been recognized for her work by her appointment as director of a new program at UConn named EPOC. That stands for Engaged Public, Oral, and Community Histories. I'm sure she'll talk about that a little bit. This EPOC formalizes the History Department's initiative to promote engaged public and oral community histories and fosters collaborative intellectual inquiry between students, faculty, and community-based organizations. We're very pleased to have Fiona Vernon with us today to talk about how we are all responsible for doing history more inclusively. And so, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Fiona Vernon.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I see some friends and colleagues. I really appreciate you coming out. And now that it's raining, I hope that's a little bit of solace for having to spend some time on Zoom, but hopefully the stories I'm going to share with you today will make it worth your while. Let me pause and share my screen. All right. Thank you so much to Doug. It has been really wonderful working with the Windsor Historical Society for the last year. And I think that the work that we've been doing in terms of trying to collect local oral histories and telling the stories of why Windsor, right? Why people moved to Windsor, what keeps them in Windsor, is very much a part of this inclusive work. And I look forward to continuing that partnership. I know that many of you are here this evening because you're deeply committed to the important conversations that are unfolding across the country and in our cultural heritage and museum spaces. I know that some of you attended Jamal Jimerson's presentation about what a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens can look like in terms of the pipeline for staff, the board, but also in terms of audience and programming. For those of you who were not there, and for those of you who were there, some of the takeaways were that intentions matter, right? The kind of programs that you put on and the impact that they have really do matter. That culture is an asset, and that the relationships that cultural heritage organizations form are going to have to exit the building. Some of the most important things that are going to happen in this diversity, equity, and inclusion space are going to happen outside of the confines of the building. And then finally, that the community needs to be a part of the decision-making process. Tonight, I want to offer some reflections on audiences and programming and different visions of community-engaged history. For the last few years, I have been engaged in exploring models of community history that's based on traveling exhibitions that can continue to iterate. That means that they can continue to be updated as they move from one location to the other, and they can also reflect the local community where the exhibit is traveling to. The exhibitions that I work on are built around themes that are drawn primarily from oral histories, and these oral histories are aimed at elevating the voices and experiences of ordinary people. And then I supplement those oral histories with archival and other collections. So whether those are photo collections, for example, or other community-based archives. And I, as Doug said, have now been officially given a really wonderful space at the University of Connecticut to do this work called EPIC, which is Engaged Public Oral and Community History. I want to talk about intention, culture and assets, relationships, community, and decision-making. I really want to make sure that the points that Jamal made are really brought out in this talk. And part of the reason for titling my talk, Removing the Gates, is because I want to think about the gatekeeping role that heritage organizations have played and how this can actually be turned into an asset for inclusion. And I want to make the first assertion that we are all responsible, excuse me. Pardon. That we are all responsible for inclusion. Yes, there is absolutely a role for consultants, DEI training, for building diverse pipelines, for staffing, for leadership that can address your internal policies and your practices and your procedures, your work climate. But there is a role for you, right? There is a reason why on a Thursday afternoon you are here in this talk. So whether that's the individual you, the collective you, your community, you are consumers, your customers, you are patrons, you have power, you have agency, you have leverage. But all of that also comes with responsibility. But because you are part of the audience, because you're a patron, because you're a customer, because you're a consumer, because you're a member of this community, I'd like you all to think about what that means as a form of agency and power. And I'd like you all to consider what responsibility that comes with. After all, most of these programs are put on in your name. And then that's why I think the general public and general audiences have a lot of agency in letting historical societies and heritage organizations know that they want inclusive programming. When an organization says that we don't put on that kind of programming because there's no audience for it, you have the power to change that particularly lazy narrative and turn that into a statement that sounds something more like, we have to put these kinds of programs on because there's a big and growing audience for it among schools, among families, and the general public. I find a call to action in the idea that the arc of history bends towards justice, but humans have to bend that arc. The systems of exclusions we're trying to fix were built and designed by humans, and it is humans who have to de-design or redesign them for better and equitable outcomes. This is not going to happen with the kind of blind faith that can move mountain. To move a mountain, you need a pick or some other kind of tool to start. And in the same vein, the kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion faith that everyone is espousing today also needs the right kind of tools and resources. Many DEI conversations are now talking about decolonizing museums. This is a systemic issue that will also take a lot of time and resources. As with so many other attempts to enact change, people want to see results soon. I know that the conversations I've been involved in around DEI, most of the folks on the receiving end of it express a lot of frustration. They don't want another survey, they don't want another focus group, and they don't need a strategic plan. The work is here, the work is now, the work is immediate. It's a long journey, and so you might as well get going, and in the meantime, leverage your assets. So tonight, I want to really emphasize that maybe this is a slightly different kind of approach that I'm recommending, because I think that the assets that exist in cultural heritage organizations, your authority, your expertise, your social and your cultural capital, all of these assets are exactly what you need to actually tell different kinds of stories. You already have a wealth of resources, right? And if you think about your authority and your knowledge and your expertise and your social and your cultural capital, and you combine those with community assets, what are you going to get? What exactly is it that the community brings? Turns out the community has the same exact assets. The community also has its own form of authority, its own degree of knowledge and expertise, and its own social and cultural capital. And so to answer the call for DEI that can be immediately impactful and intentional, I propose that we look at all of this from an asset mindset and think about combining what assets there are traditionally with what the community is bringing. And that will bring you new collections, it will bring new stories, it will take you into new venues, and it will provide you with new partners. And by the time most of you emerge from your DEI workshops, that's exactly what they have asked you to do. They've asked you to rethink your collections. How are you going to collect to tell new stories? If your collection does not support more inclusive stories, you need to update your collecting policies. What are those new stories that you can tell? What are the new venues? Everything doesn't have to happen in your building. How are you going to go out into the community and empower people to tell stories where they are? And what new partnerships are you going to be able to develop? So I would like to share with you a model of how we're doing it. We are particularly interested at the University of Connecticut in leveraging the authority and the expertise and the knowledge of the university community for the greater good of our local community. And that means that for this new initiative, which we launched in 2021, we would like to pay attention to community archives that are then going to be teamed up with university archives, with historical societies, with libraries, with oral histories at their core. I am at a particular point in my career, especially for those of you who know me, where community engaged projects are very much front and center of what I envision sort of spending the rest of my time doing. And it means I get to tell stories like this. So I'm going to transition to telling you a story about a family that I discovered that is going to be a part of our EPIC projects. So I would like you to meet the Thompsons. I do not yet have pictures of them, so you will have to bear with me. Doward Sr. and Doward Jr. These are the Thompsons. In June 1912, Doward Thompson boarded the ship, the Obedience, not a misspelling of obedience, in Port Antonio, Jamaica. He was aboard a ship that was built in Liverpool, England, and that ship had had its maiden voyage in 1891. Doward was 26 years old. He was 5'9", and the records describe him as dark complexion. I have no idea if that means he's dark complexion like me or not. He was headed to New York. He'd paid his own passage, and he had $50 on him. Just a lot of money at that time. He was one of 69,000 Jamaican migrants. This is the ship and other ships like this that he boarded. I was really excited to find his ship. He was one of 69,000 Jamaican migrants who left the island between 1891 and 1911. He left to Jamaica. Jamaica had a very tiny population then. I have this outline map of Jamaica here for you, of about 639,000 folks. And of that, about 69,000 had left the country in those decades. And of that number, 16,000 had gone to New York specifically. They were, like other migrants, seeking new opportunities, new jobs, and new adventures. Doward came to New York, but many of the other migrants had gone to Costa Rica. Some of them had gone to Cuba. Some of them, of course, as many of you know, had gone to build the Panama, would come to build the Panama Canal. I'm not sure if Doward was headed to a family or friend. You had to list that in your documents, but he was stopping over in Brooklyn with somebody named Cyril. Despite the enclave of West Indians in New York, Doward didn't necessarily want to stay there. I'm still trying to investigate why, but I found him in Hartford just a few years later. We lose him in the record until 1918. So he comes to New York, he lands in Brooklyn in 1912. He is in Brooklyn for a few years. We lose him in the record, and then he turns up in Hartford in 1918 for the draft. He doesn't necessarily, he enlists, but he doesn't go because the war is over about two months after he enlists. By 1920, between 1920 and 1930, so this is just an example of the pain and horror of reading cursive to try to find a little bit more information about Doward. But here's Doward and his family. In 1920, I actually found him living with an Irish widower named James King, along with King's two daughters who were in their 20s. The other one was 19, and four other Black male lodgers. King worked for the railroad, but he seemed to not be able to afford his rent by himself, and he too was paying rent. So we have an Irish widower who is paying rent and who's taken on four Black men into his rental to help him to offset his expenses. At this time in 1920, Doward is working as a waiter at the Hartford Club. He lists the same address, so he seems to be fairly stable at this particular address for a few years, because it's the same place that I find him having registered for World War I. By 1920, Doward was married, and he had his first son by 1921. He was married to someone who had also made a journey to Hartford, but this time from Georgia. His wife is Verda Mae Jarrett. I don't know how they met yet, but by the time they ended their life in Hartford, they'd raised 5 sons and 2 daughters, and they had lost one daughter to an unnamed illness when she was 5. Between 1918 and 1970, Thompson made a series of moves. Here is his initial address where you see he's a lodger, he's age 33. At the time, he would get married about 2 years after this particular record. Here is his draft registration card, followed by his son's draft registration card, and then his old man draft registration card, which is actually what the record said, old man draft registration card. Between 1918 and 1970, Thompson made a series of moves over the north end of Hartford. He lived on Barber Street, Pliny Street, Worcester Street, Bellevue Street. Then, after living on Bellevue Street, he moved up Bellevue Street, down Bellevue Street, up Worcester Street, down Worcester Street. Sometimes it seemed as if it was just maybe 4 or 5 addresses away from the previous address. And at one time, we find him living at Bellevue Square, which is the first Black public housing project in Hartford. And so this is a really interesting window into the ways in which Black people were trying to navigate housing in Hartford. Most of you are probably familiar with the tenement housing crisis that captured the national imagination. But somewhere in the footnote, despite New York sort of being the center of that imagination about how horrible housing is, Hartford featured really prominently, literally in a footnote, that for a city of its size, that Hartford was just as bad as New York at the turn of the 20th century. So compared to other cities of its size, the kind of, the quality of the housing and the supply of the housing actually put Hartford on par with New York, and also put Hartford on par with how expensive housing was. And so at the turn of the 20th century, so right now there are bills being considered in the legislature about making housing a human right, and trying to address the disproportionate burden of housing, where people sometimes have to pay, sometimes 30, 35% of their income on housing. And the vast majority of Black people in Hartford started encountering this particular problem at the turn of the century. They were already experiencing housing shortages. In 1942, Doward Sr. and Doward Jr. both signed draft registration cards. Luckily, it was not intended for military service, because Doward Sr. is quite old at this time. But after Pearl Harbor, the US had initiated a draft that reached beyond younger age groups. And one of the purposes of that was to help build the US confidence. They wanted a complete inventory of what their manpower resources could be and how they could call people up for national service. And so registration took place in 1942, if you were not already in the military. And so we find Doward, that is his son, and then we find Doward here. And you can see at the top of the registration card, it says men born on or after February 17th, 1897, or on or before December 31st, 1921. It was really interesting to find father and son, both signed up. It gives you a tremendous amount of information about where they're living, who their next of kin is. And as you can see, Doward Jr. here is working at Colt's Patent Firearms. And his father is working for someone named James Sexton at 506 Farmington Avenue. So I have to, I'm still in the middle of researching this family, so I have to figure out what building, what employment was at 506 Farmington Avenue at this time. The Doward family would continue to move around in the North End. They continued moving around even into their old age. I don't have enough evidence to fully support this assertion, but compared to one other person that I will speak about tonight, I would say that they did not have the kind of housing stability that they were looking for. Another son, Edwin Thompson, enlisted and in the Army. And he eventually settled in Springfield, Massachusetts, where he was a beloved and lifelong neighborhood barber, and lots of stories and tributes came out after he died around, I think, 2002. In 1943, and this trunk is from one of the West Indian workers I'm going to mention. In 1943, the Greater Hartford area would receive a new generation of West Indian men. If you recall, Doward Sr. had gotten here sometime in the 19-teens and in the 1940s during the war. And because of the war effort, West Indians were invited to contribute and especially to aid shade tobacco growers. After the war, the shade tobacco growers would use their leverage to try to continue this guest worker program, and they were fairly successful and played a really pivotal role in getting the US to sign on to this guest worker program, despite the chorus of voices that pushed for Mexican labor exclusively. Within 7 years, so the first group of West Indian men arrived in the US in 1943 during the war. They disembarked at many different ports because it was so difficult. It was so dangerous for them with German U-boats all around. And so folks disembarked down south and then got on trains and got on buses to actually come to Hartford. There are about 8,400 men who come to the US in 1843. The number would shoot up to 20,000, but this is a difficult figure to parse because some of the men who are here in 1943 don't get counted in 1944. They're still here in 1944 and they don't get counted in 1945. A lot of the men would have their contracts renewed and they would be borrowed for other crops. So for example, Mr. Dorman here, he came, he worked in Windsor, and then he was borrowed for the sugar crop in Louisiana. And so lots of the West Indian men who came here in the 40s, rather than go home, they circulated. They went to go pick peas, they went to go pick corn, they went to go pick apples, and they were pretty much passed from one grower to the other because there was such a tremendous shortage of labor. Within 7 years, so the first group arrived in 1943. Within 7 years, by 1950, they had founded the West Indian Social Club on one of the streets where Thompson Sr. used to live. Some of these men, just like Thompson before him, would marry African-American women. A lot of these African-American women, they met in town or they met in the fields. A lot of African-American women were responsible for sowing the tobacco leaves together. And so that was one opportunity for the men to meet them. But at the time in the 1940s, and for a short window into the 1960s, West Indian men were feted, meaning the governor might come out, certainly the mayor would come out. There would be an exhibition cricket match, and there was a welcoming of the men when they got to Hartford, and then there was a farewell. They were put on buses and taken into town for shopping. And the churches also would pick the men up and bring them into town on Sunday for services based on their various denominational affiliations. And there was a level of pride and gratitude shown by the Greater Hartford community for the kind of service the men were rendering. Now, I venture to say, West Indian men arrive. If you're not familiar with the season of the shade tobacco crop, you have no idea that they're here. They come, they work, they leave. There is no exhibition match. There's no mayor or governor, sort of throwing out the first pitch or anything like that. And so there was a very different kind of feeling and a very different kind of emotion surrounding the relationships that West Indians had in the 1940s. The relationships that West Indians formed with African American women especially played a really important role in creating that first enclave of West Indians. So we're all familiar with Florida and New York, right? Especially as a gateway city for all manner of immigrants. So before Hartford, it was New York and Florida that had a fairly large West Indian population. But with this program that started in 1943, that was the beginning of the building of a major West Indian community here, so much so that by 2010, West Indians became the largest foreign-born population in the state. It's very difficult, it's very difficult to disaggregate the West Indian and the African American population, right? So Doward Sr. is West Indian, but Doward Jr. is born in Hartford, and so he gets integrated into the census figure as African American. There's one other person I'd like to mention quickly, and that is for the contrast to the kinds of housing challenges and experiences that the Thompson family had. And this is Walter Murray. He's born in 1874, so just a few years before Thompson. He's originally from Virginia, and there's a significant proportion of the African-American the African-American community who originate from Georgia, who are moving to the greater Hartford region in the late 19th century. Later on, so by the time we get to 1930, this will completely shift to 40% of the population being from Georgia. The class background, the educational backgrounds of the African-American migrants who are coming in the earlier period looks very, very different. And I think the experiences of Walter Murray helped to capture that. He moves to Hartford and he becomes a messenger to Governor Cross. He leverages his earnings into buying a grocery store on Mather Street. And then he takes more of his income and leverages it. And he buys property on Warren Street, on Capon Street, on Martin Street, and another property on Mather Street. He keeps his property in Hartford, and continues to play a really important role in local politics, right? Until he's the biggest African-American landowner at one point. And he has all manner of tenants, and you find him all over the records because people aren't paying rent. And I guess he's taking them to the equivalent of what would be housing court. And so you find his name all over the place in the property records. He served as a delegate in the Democratic State Convention. And later on, he's listed as a toolmaker living in Windsor for 14 years. He still keeps his property and his grocery store in Hartford, but he's an example of someone who is able to leverage his income and his family connections to grow fairly wealthy in Hartford. The Thompson and Maury stories are incomplete, but they tell us quite a bit. They connect us to an early history of the West Indian diaspora through the gateway city of New York. And it tells us that clearly Hartford had some particular attractions that couldn't hold West Indians, because someone like Thompson would make Hartford his home for the next 6 decades. These kinds of stories that EPIC is investigating connects the Great Migration traditions of African Americans to the Great Migration traditions of West Indians. If there were more time, I would talk to you about Thompson listing his parents as Puerto Ricans and talk about the Great Migration traditions of Puerto Ricans, but that's another talk. But it's a really important window into what diversity looks like within the African, what would become the African American community, and to help us understand that when we're talking about the African American community, that there were so many ways in which people were pulling on different threads of the diaspora, right? So whether someone from Jamaica married, right, Thompson from Jamaica marries a woman from Georgia, or someone like Murray makes sure that he marries within his Virginia network specifically, but it gives us a little bit of sense of the flavor of what diversity looks like within the African American community. It leverages their experiences as evidence. It tells us about what poor housing condition means for people who are living in the Black community, but it also shows us how some people were able to leverage their income to achieve economic success and mobility. These men as well, so the draft registration cards have been really a really important part of this research. And it also shows you that for a particular generation of men at the turn of the 20th century, had to make some really important decisions about how if they were going to participate in World War I. And a significant proportion of the African American population decided to enlist. And it sort of underscores the stories of honor and valor and the role that military service has played as a path to respectability for the African American community. I've only begun to tug a little bit at the religious threads with connections I've found to Union Baptist Church and to the AME Church. But we don't have time for those threads today. What I think this tells us about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the possibilities of telling more inclusive stories is that these stories are hidden in plain sight. I didn't have to do any extraordinary research to tell you about Durward or Durward Sr. or about Walter Murray. I dug through passenger manifests and city directories and birth and marriage and death registries. It didn't require extra resources to tell these stories, but it does require intention as Jamal reminded us in his talk. It requires a mindset that acknowledges that the cultural experiences of Thompson and Murray and their families and communities are assets. It reminds us that their experiences are really important windows into the American experience. These are quintessentially American stories. They are many other stories, but they are American stories. The gaps in these stories will require the kinds of relationships that Jamal suggested will need to be forged outside of the archival building, whether that is outside of Windsor's archive or outside of the Connecticut Historical Society archives and the many other archives that I've used to put this story together. It will require being a sleuth and checking potential church records. It will require reaching out to the descendants of these families who I found, some in Springfield and some in East Hartford, but I haven't reached out to them yet. But if the Windsor Historical Society were curating this story, right, that would be the exact kind of outreach that should happen. And when these stories are available, that will be the moment to ask how the families can curate them, co-curate them, and where the family can fit into the decision-making process about like what venue are we going to be telling these stories. This format for Zoom is great. This will live on YouTube forever. And what's the afterlife of the story? One of the goals of EPIC is to address the fact that at some point exhibits have to come down, right? And EPIC has designed its exhibits so that they will never expire and they will always continue to iterate, because the people who donate their oral histories will have the stories, and they will be in schools, they will be online, and they will have an afterlife. No one to my knowledge has ever interviewed the Thompsons or the Murrays. We've had to piece their stories together from fragmentary stories. So my next charge for Windsor and other historical societies is, at some point, we have to stop complaining that we don't have the collections to support the kinds of stories that need to be told. Because at some point, we have to acknowledge that this is not necessarily the generation to have kept a diary. And the current generation, right? Are we going to have to wade through millions of email in the future to figure out the stories we want to tell of ordinary people? I myself am really glad I'm not going to be that historian who has to go through anybody's email to do anything with them. But I think we are at the perfect inflection point to sort of dust off oral histories, revisit oral histories as a way to get to some of the 21st century collecting priorities, because they're definitely going to be holes. My life as a historian would be so much better, right, if somebody had interviewed Mr. Thompson, junior or senior, or if somebody had thought to interview the biggest Black landowner in Hartford. And we don't have to wait until people have one foot in the grave. We can interview them when they're in their 40s or in their 50s, right? We don't have to wait until we think people have turned into hoary sayers and have some kind of wisdom to impart. I think the most important low-hanging fruit that we can pick in terms of being more inclusive is to actually be the space and use our voices and use our expertise and our authority and our training to encourage everyone to capture their family's stories. So that instead of complaining about not having the collection, I would absolutely love it if one day I'm in a board meeting at X Historical Society, and the complaint is that we have captured so many family histories and so many community histories. We have too many stories to tell. I'm going to share with you now, about 2 minutes, please, if you can bear with me. When Doward Sr. moved here, the West Indian community was minuscule, a handful of people in the 19 teens. And I'm not sure how portable his West Indian culture was, but he soon had a wonderful solution to that problem, because in 1950, with the creation of the West Indian Social Club, that all changed. And Hartford began to reflect the space that it is now as a West Indian city, right? As an African American city, as a Puerto Rican city, as a mostly Jamaican city, because people started to occupy Hartford in a very, very different way. So I'm going to show you guys the West Indian community that Doward Johnson was able to join in the latter part of his life, once there was an enclave. And so mostly I went through the community archive that I'm working with, and I plucked some images from the West Indian parades, the early ones over the years. So I will go through those. So this is the truck float that was sponsored by the shade tobacco growers to help promote the idea that there is a symbiotic relationship between the shade tobacco growers and West Indian workers, deeply problematic as that idea might be. And you can see spectators. This is the West Indian Women's Auxiliary float. Float building was a really big thing that came from the Caribbean with West Indian migrants. Men on horseback. And so this is some of what Doward would have been able to see, not in 1918. He had to wait. He had to wait a little bit later to see this, but it was a common occurrence to see Black men on horseback during the West Indian parade that started after 1962. Here is Queen of Sheba, women from the Queen of Sheba. Here are men from one of the main lodge, Utopia Lodge, which is right across the street from the West Indian Social Club, and right now its current location, and which share a lot of members. Here's sort of a little bit of what the crowds looked like during the parade. Here is the first clubhouse that was actually down the street from one of Doward Thompson's house. This is a multi-family house that was rehabbed to become the first West Indian social club. And then the area was rezoned, and then the West Indian Social Club moved to its current location on Main Street. This previous location is 353 Barber Street, and this picture is taken from the 9th anniversary, which means that's 1969. Here is the float of the Caribbean American Society. I think they used to kick the butt of the West Indian Social Club as far as float making all of the time. Here are the participants in the Miss West Indian parade. And one of them would be crowned, and then they would be doing their Queen's wave on the floats during the parade. Here is the third anniversary in front of that same club. And here is my last slide, which says, the next generation, African-American children of West Indian descent. And when I look at these kids, all of whom are in college right now, I think about the kinds of stories, even I, as a historian who's connected to these children, I think about the ways in which my kids don't read my book, right? They don't, my kids are running away from my presentations and my books. And the way that I have to try to explain to my children, like why I left Jamaica and what my motivations were, so that when they're thinking about their heritage and their culture and their family history, they'll actually be able to answer those questions. So that is my last slide. I am going to stop share. And then if you could just bear with me for 1 minute, I have to swap screens with you to show you one animation that will capture a little bit of the work that we are trying to do at EPIC. So let's see if I can switch screens again. All right. All right, when this animation begins again, please pay attention to the yellow dots. This is a dot density animation we're working on to show how African Americans came to settle in the North End and moved across Keeney Park into the Blue Hills area. We are using the Italian population as a control, but we are mapping all of the various ethnic groups in the greater Hartford region. And you can see how it starts at the turn of the 20th century and how African Americans are slowly moving, right? They're on the other side of Keeney Park. Now they're heading into the Blue Hills, area. And again, let me stop share there. This is the kind of work that we're doing at the University of Connecticut to try to tell the stories of why Hartford, why Windsor, why Bloomfield? How did Connecticut become the third largest Jamaican community? How did West Indians become the largest foreign-born population? What does it mean that the South Asian population is growing so phenomenally fast in Hartford and in Manchester, for example? We have to, if we're going to take diversity, equity, and inclusion seriously, we have to document the now. We have to look around at what's going on in our communities right now and make sure we don't wait until those people are 90 or 80 to ask, right? Like, what brought you from Bangladesh? What brought you from Pakistan? What brought you from Barbados? What brought you from Jamaica? It is really exciting. It is really interesting. It's really fascinating. And I think that although the times are really fraught around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I hope the time that I've spent with you this evening has given you a little bit of a taste of what that work can look like as well. So thank you.
All right, Fiona, thank you.
Yes.
Wow, a lot to think about. Oh,
I timed it perfectly.
We'd have listened forever. So there is one question in the chat box. Thank you, Cheryl Curtis, who asks, how do you decide what stories you want to tell?
So in so many different ways, I have graduate and undergraduate interns who are working with me on this initiative, and sometimes they find a story and they bring it to me, and sometimes I will do a presentation like this, and I will get a phone call that says, you were talking about my uncle or my aunt, and I have an artifact for you. So the trunk that I showed you of the West Indian worker who came in the 1940s, that was after a sort of a long engagement with the family of telling their stories, and then they went to Jamaica to get that trunk for me, so that we could capture that artifact. There's so many men who came, right? The 8,400 men, for example, who came in 1943. They all came with a trunk. And when I was in Jamaica, I used to see these trunks. I had no idea that these trunks had any historical value, right? Because we've all moved on to fancy suitcases and we don't travel with trunks anymore. And I cannot tell you how many of these trunks people threw away because you don't want to hold on to like old things, right? And you want to modernize. So the stories kind of emerge naturally. And then I am building a database of obituaries right now, which might sound a little bit morbid, but I actually love reading obituaries, because as for folks who don't write letters and don't keep diaries and who are not particularly conscious about keeping their family history, I'm really curious to see what how they present themselves, right? Because this is the last opportunity for you to sort of present yourself, or for your family to present your life history. So I've always been interested in obituaries, right? Like like what obituaries of Black people was the New York Times publishing in the 19th century, right? And I was always fascinated by that, and I've sort of taken that lens, and I'm now applying it to try to understand how people were presenting themselves in Hartford. So there's lots of different ways that I pick stories. I'm documenting the West Indian community in Hartford, and so I'm trying to go through systematically and interview all of the members of that club. And I'm working on and I'm working on Puerto Rican and African American migration to Hartford as well. So I, have 3 to 5 oral histories per week, and I just kind of envision doing that indefinitely and trying to tell as much of those stories as I can. Thank you, Cheryl, for that. Are there some ways to capture the interests of children in the stories and personal history? Kathleen, can you clarify, like do you mean how to make the stories appealing to children? Yes. Right now, my children, I think I've worked with high school students. I haven't worked too much with lower grades, but one of the things that I do is that I go in before COVID, is I partner with a couple of schools, and I go in and I sort of give an overview of oral histories and sort of very bare bones consent. And the students usually do a project where they interview someone, and then they host their own exhibition. And then if they want to share that story, then share that story with my exhibition, then I can integrate the students' stories into the larger exhibition. And it's been absolutely phenomenal before COVID. We did a big project at Metropolitan Learning Center at Blue Hills Extension, and the students picked all manner of people they interviewed the security guard. I think they were bothering the administrative secretary in the office. They interviewed their parents, their uncles, their barber. They picked all kinds of individuals, and they had a lot of fun with it. So that's something we were meant to repeat every year. And then the students have a showcase, and the parents and the community come out, and I put on my exhibition and the students put on their exhibition, but we have been on hiatus because of COVID. So that's one of the ways for integrating students into this project. And then this May, we'll see how that goes. We are doing a symposium on shade tobacco growing. And we've invited students in Massachusetts, well, the entire Connecticut River Valley, right? Anywhere shade tobacco is grown. We've invited students to develop a creative piece that engages with the history of shade tobacco culture, especially around the history of labor. I have no idea what they're going to produce. The show is happening mid-May, and it's an online digital exhibition. I can give the details to Doug to send out to the listserv. But I have a student who says students are performing poetry, and somebody is doing something in visual arts, and somebody is developing a game. So those are some of the ways that I've tried to engage young people. Tobacco, yes. So was tobacco a big part of what made the region attractive to West Indians? You know, I think if they developed like deep sea mining in Alaska and told West Indians that there was like a means of transporting them there, I think they would go. All of that to say, West Indians will follow a job anywhere as long as it's a job, right? So they're cutting sugarcane in Florida and Louisiana, and they are working tobacco here, but they're picking apples, and they're working in the citrus orchards. So from the 1930s, I mean, in some ways, the Great Recession, the Depression in Jamaica really opened people up to coming to the United States once the US wanted to recruit. And I don't think they've ever looked back, but West Indians played a really important role in building the Panama Canal, right? And before that, they were working in Costa Rica, and before that, they were working in Cuba, and they have gone to Trinidad to work in the oil industry. So West Indians have been highly mobile, and for this particular region, the shade tobacco growers, as you guys know, have tried to use every means to capture labor, whether it's summer labor of young people and college kids, or the guest workers. And they've always had these labor bottlenecks that they've tried to resolve. And West Indian workers, and of course, Puerto Rican workers, and now Central American workers play a really important role in bringing the crop to harvest. So it's certainly, yes, shade tobacco certainly brought people to Hartford, but a lot of folks who West Indians who came here during the African-American Great Migration sort of get lost in the picture. And in the same way that African-Americans were attracted to the jobs that were here, the earlier West Indian population was attracted to the possibility of manufacturing jobs in Hartford. And so that's actually the reason why a lot of them like left New York to come to Hartford. And then this sort of interesting statement that I now understand because that's how I feel, but New York is not for everybody. Like there's some people who are diehard New Yorkers, and then there's some people who New York is just for visiting, but it's definitely not for living. And Connecticut was very rural, is very rural, and it reminds you of home, right? And you can have a yard and you can have a backyard, and you can have space and fresh air. And in the oral histories that I've done, a lot of people said that they just couldn't live in New York. They couldn't live on top of each other. They didn't want to live in apartment buildings. And so that attraction as well, that kind of aesthetic feel to Connecticut that reminded folks of Jamaica. Let's see, Lisa. So what can history museums do to make these communities more comfortable working with us? I think probably the most important thing that museums can do is to not treat collecting like an extractive industry, right? Like, you've discovered that you have minorities in your neighborhood, or in this DEI moment, everybody wants to work with communities of color. You can't do it as one and done, and you can't do it as an extractive industry, because it is very exhausting to try to have all of these people suddenly, all of these organizations suddenly interested in working with you. And a lot of communities and a lot of people don't have the capacity to maintain many relationships. And so it's really important to be authentic. You can't just sort of discover communities of color and want to host all of the programs at your space and want to collect their artifacts and collect their stories to enhance your collection and your programming. I think it's really important to share your knowledge and to share your expertise and to offer your training and offer your space, but also be willing to meet people on their own terms. The same thing is so the same thing that's happening at the institutional level, right, where a lot of organizations want to do outreach and engage, is also happening to individuals, right? So like all of a sudden I'm a hot commodity, which I appreciate, but I am literally not doing anything different than what I was doing before. It's just that some people are suddenly paying attention. And that's a little paternalistic, right? And if I'm okay, I won't say his name on, since we're being recorded, but there is a Black museum professional, and there were so few Black museum professionals that he had to be everybody's partner. That is absolutely ridiculous, right? I'm only one person. That person, who shall not be named, is only one person. We can't be partners. We can't be partners on everything. So although I wasn't talking, pipeline and staff and board development is not my wheelhouse. That's Jamal's wheelhouse. That's where you address that's where you address those issues. You have to go out and forge those relationships and build those relationships way before you can address address some of these issues. And to be very honest, as a Black professional historian, I feel like a shiny bauble, right? That folks are just coming after. And I hope 5 years from now, right, that interest will be there. So another question is this sustainable, right? Are you still going to be interested when nobody's looking? And are you actually going to update your collections to reflect different kinds of archiving? One of the things that's disturbing to me is that a lot of organizations think that they can address their diversity and equity issues with like cultural programming. So we'll bring this poet and we'll bring this singer or we'll bring this band, right? We'll bring these like really if wonderful, but it's ephemeral. And you guys have to collect that those performances actually need to be curated and integrated into your collection and then made accessible later on, right? To say, look at the 25 jazz bands that we brought, right, in the last 5 years. Maybe now that we have this collection of performances, maybe there's a story we can tell about jazz, right? So you can't just isolate, you can't just say, okay, we'll solve the outreach problem with programming and we'll bring in all the communities of color and they'll perform and they'll sing and they'll dance, but then nothing else changes, right? Your collection still looks the same. Your exhibitions still look the same. Your staff still looks the same. So I think it's I tried to present a very optimistic picture of, look, there are low-hanging fruit. There are lots of stories that are very easy to tell if you're willing to do the legwork. That's the low-hanging fruit, but then it doesn't mean that the hard work shouldn't continue. So like, don't be extractive and don't treat Black professionals like shiny baubles, like we're commodities, and make sure, I mean, I envision I will continue to work with the Windsor Historical Society, but I'm really curious to see what's going to happen, 5 years from now. The West Indian Social Club, I venture to say, has the richest archive of Caribbean history in the Northeast. It is where I got all of the images that are here that I showed you, all of those parade images. That's where it all comes from. They have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of photographs, and they've kept everything. They've kept their bar receipts from 1950, like everything. They've kept the envelope, like if they were having a vote and somebody didn't have a piece of paper and they voted on an envelope, they kept the envelope. They kept everything because they weren't sure what was valuable in the moment and what would be valuable now 71 years later. And they're no fires, no natural disasters or anything like that. We've lost a few things yeah, there was a flood. But we've been able to hold on to almost everything. And that archive is really important. It is going to, when I finish writing the book from that archive, I'm hoping it will kind of recenter Hartford in the overall history of Caribbean migration, because I'm excited as a historian that New York gets so much press, but Hartford has its own story to tell. And it's not all about it's not just about New York and Florida, right? Hartford is a Caribbean city, right? Hartford is a West Indian city and a Puerto Rican city and an African American city, and that story definitely needs to be told. Collecting personal stories, often too late. Yes, that's what I meant when it's like, don't wait until somebody is 90 or 80. Like, people are interesting in their 40s, right? And in their 50s. You don't have to wait. An app that the younger generation could use to capture the history of their elders with some leading questions about what might be of interest to these backstories. Yeah, that was the last point I wanted to make, which is that we in the cultural heritage field, that is the most important task at hand, is to help to develop and then maintain and sustain and disseminate, but develop and maintain and sustain that historical consciousness so that young people will talk to their family members little by little. We don't need an app. Everybody has, well, most young people have a smartphone. They are walking around with a computer in their hand. The camera is phenomenal on Samsung and Apple. The voice recorder has phenomenal sound quality. There are many apps. Temi is one of them, if for those of you who are on here who are interested. Temi as an app is pretty phenomenal. It only costs 10 cents per minute to transcribe. The interview you record on Temi only costs 10 cents per minute to transcribe. 10 cents. So the app is there, the technology is there. Even if anything you record an interview on, you can upload it to Temi. So even if you don't record within the app, you can upload it to Temi, run the transcription, and then you can edit, right? Because it will mess up Spanish names and things like that. But it's a really great start. So I think all of the programs that have been created, whether that's StoryCorps, for example, to encourage people to talk to each other, and then it's archived at the Library of Congress, or the Veterans Oral History Project. The frameworks are all there. So now what we can do, those of us in the cultural heritage field, is to just keep pointing people to them, to say, hey, like, go ahead and do a StoryCorps recording with your family. And if there's a veteran in your family, consider recording that history and being part of the Veterans History Project with the Library of Congress. But we definitely should not wait until people are elder. We have a lot of knowledge. We have a lot of knowledge to impart at all different stages of our life. So I think the historical societies and museums and heritage organizations should just hold all kind of recordathons, right? Where we encourage people to come in and use the space and set up booths after the pandemic is over, and to share these stories, which there will be more than enough people to do the work, right? I'm interviewing far more people than stories I can tell, but I'm building a collection, and the historians and the families and the organizations that will use these oral histories, when I'm no longer around, like that's the legacy that I would like to leave. But if we were all engaged in a collective effort, if like every single historical society in our 169 towns decided to launch an oral history collecting project, we would make so much progress.
Fiona, that's amazing. I really appreciate what you're saying. I wanted to ask you a question, and I think local historical societies. And by the way, if there's 169 towns in Connecticut, there's probably 183 local historical societies in Connecticut. But I think we are uniquely positioned to be a trusted historical repository for these oral histories. But you made a really important point about building trust. And even though historical societies have been in communities in some cases, like Windsor and several others, 100 years or more, we still have struggles establishing trust, right? And building trust or getting inroads. And I see Florence Barlow shaking her head. Florence, thankfully, has been so wonderful at helping us, to establish relationships with people that were involved in the WACA group, which is the Windsor Afro-American Civic Association, the focus of our current oral history collecting project. But when I first met you, Fiona, you were actually on the board of the West Indian Social Club, if I'm not
The foundation.
The West Indian Foundation. Thank you. And you told me why you joined that board. And would you be willing to share that with the group? Because it's not always just a matter of race, right? I mean, it's a matter of trust, even within cultural groups, that you have to earn before people are willing to share.
Right. I mean, I'm from Jamaica, and I'm a member of the West Indian Social Club, and I'm a member of the board of the West Indian Foundation, which emerged from the West Indian Social Club as its nonprofit arm, but does its own foundation work, now. And there is an ease with which I navigate these relationships, but I also had to do the work. I have been in the West Indian community since I was a grad student in New Haven. I actually had to take a year off from graduate school to finish the oral history projects because I couldn't do both. I couldn't do my graduate work and do all of these oral histories, but it was so important. It was so important to me to be able to capture the stories of the founding fathers of the West Indian Social Club and the West Indian Foundation. But that didn't give me an automatic in, right? So I left. I went to Michigan. And when I came back, I had to start over again, right? I had to start over to build those relationships because there were new people. In charge, and I don't think that I had any different experiences than the ones that I had in South Africa, which is that you can't engage in transactional relationships that are extractive. You have to be in the space, and you have to socialize. You have to be in the space. You have to socialize with folks, and people really need to be able to get something out of the relationship. And so, after being a member of the West Indian Social Club, I decided that I would lend my skills as a historian to the board at the West Indian Foundation as one of the ways to sort of pay it forward or pay it back, and be a resource in my own community. And it takes time, and there is absolutely no shortcut. There's no shortcut to building these relationships. But now that relationship has been reestablished, it gives me a little bit of authority to make suggestions and recommendations about how to preserve the legacy of those organizations. And then I stay in my wheelhouse, and my wheelhouse is history and cultural heritage. And so I focus on making those contributions to those organizations.
Yeah, thank you. That I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I think that's a really, really important point about trust building, about being there, about being present. The same is true working with the Native American community. The same is true, I served in the Middle East and building relationships with our Middle Eastern partners. It's, Americans get frustrated because the first 2 or 3 meetings are all about talking about their family and drinking tea, and they used to complain because we're all action oriented, right? Want to go over there and start doing stuff. And said, no, you've got to get to build the relationship before you can actually start to do things. And the same is true in this work as well. It's nothing, it's not kind of a new phenomenon, but it's maybe new to us in some ways, because I think organizations are trying to break out of their customary circle of the same people that they've always collected information from or worked with, and that's really, really important. We are about at the end of our hour and a half, and it's gone by really fast for me. I could listen much, much longer. And Fiona, it's been fantastic. You've tied it in beautifully with Jamal Jimerson's presentation, which we didn't really ask you to do, but I really appreciate you making the extra effort to kind of tie in the threads, because there's such a strong connection between both of your programs, and making it so personal and accessible to all of us that were here. So I can't thank you enough. And there's
thank you.
Everybody gets to applaud.
Thank you, guys. I really applaud what the Windsor Historical Society is trying to do. And long before the strategic plan, long before, all of the other work that needed to get done, Doug acknowledged the need to sort of just get out there in the community. And so at a future date, I hope to share some stories, further stories with you guys about why Windsor, because now I'm asking myself, like what brought people to Windsor specifically and what kept people grounded in Windsor. So hopefully the next time I talk to you guys, I'll be able to share some of those stories. Have a great evening.
We hope that maybe someday you'll be one of those why Windsor people, right? We'd love to have you move to Windsor. That's a possibility.
All right.
So one quick thing before we sign off, and I do want to thank everyone here for joining us tonight. I want to thank Sue Tate Porcaro for being our production engineer and troubleshooter there in the behind the scenes. As the weather warms up, we will be shifting our programming outdoors and in person. And I'm very pleased to say that Fiona will be back with us again on Wednesday, June 23rd at 6:30, where we will be opening her exhibit in the Chafee House, which will be a new use for that venerable building. The exhibit's called A Home Away from Home, Greater Hartford's West Indian Diaspora. It will be an exhibit opening and the Windsor Historical Society's annual meeting and program. So please pardon my faux pas. I do it at least once every program. I don't know how that slipped in there, but so I hope you'll join us for that. And thank you all again for joining us tonight.
All right, take care.